She looked at the river before she looked at him. That was the first thing anyone on that platform noticed, and half the town was watching. A woman steps off a train to marry a stranger, and instead of searching the crowd for his face, she stares past everyone at moving water like she's checking it against something she already knows. Nobody in Cedar Fork had ever seen a bride do that. They wouldn't forget it either. This is a story about a mill, a river, and two people who fell in love the way you'd true a wheel. Slowly, patiently, one small correction at a time. Until the whole thing finally ran without a catch in it. My name doesn't matter here. I'm just the one who kept the record the way she kept hers. Let me tell you what happened in Cedar Fork, Kansas, starting on a gray Tuesday in October of 1881. The town had 19 buildings on its one real street, and a depot platform that doubled as the only stage anybody in Cedar Fork ever performed on. Whatever mattered in that town either got off that train or got on it. There wasn't a third option. The cottonwoods along the Cedar Fork River had turned overnight, or close enough. Nobody could say exactly when, only that one evening they were green, and by morning they were the color of old brass. Joseph Marsh stood near the far end of the platform holding his hat in both hands, working the brim between his fingers without seeming to notice he was doing it. He was tall, narrow through the shoulders, built with the kind of careful stillness men get from years of standing near machines that could take an arm off if you weren't paying attention. 6 weeks earlier, he'd placed a notice in a German and Norwegian paper that circulated out of St. Louis. He'd gotten 3 replies. He'd answered one. The train came down out of the bend slow, iron complaining against iron, and the platform filled up the way small towns fill up around anything that breaks a weekday in half. Not a crowd exactly. Just people who'd found reasons to be nearby. The station master, 2 women from the dry goods counter, a boy of about 14 sitting on a shipping crate with no obvious business there at all. By supper, the whole town would know what she looked like. By breakfast, the rest of the county. She came down from the second car with one trunk behind her and a leather satchel over her own shoulder. Her hand resting on the strap, the way you keep a hand on something you have no intention of setting down. Her coat was dark wool, plain, cut for weather rather than admiration. She stood on the platform boards and looked at the river, visible in strips between the cottonwoods, dark and businesslike in its current. She studied it the way you study a number you've been carrying around in your head for a long time, checking it now against the real thing. Then she turned and found him. He'd stopped working the hat brim. He held it flat against his leg instead, which wasn't more comfortable, just different. Their eyes held for a second. His dropped briefly to the trunk, then came back up. She crossed the platform herself without waiting to be fetched. Closer up, she was younger than the advertisement's careful wording had let him imagine, and her face gave away nothing, not cold, not warm. Just the settled composure of someone who has landed in a number of hard places and learned not to spend anything before she understands the true cost of it. "You're the mill owner," she said in English that had clearly been practiced. "I am," he said, "Joseph Marsh. Ilse Renner." She didn't offer her hand. She picked the satchel up higher on her shoulder instead, like she was settling in for a walk she already expected to be long. He took her to the mill first, not the house. Not a boarding room where a proper bride might wait to be received. The mill, she didn't remark on it. She simply followed him down the main street and along the river path, quiet, watching the water the whole way like she was pacing herself against its current. The mill was 2 stories of timber and river stone, built into the bank where the Cedar Fork narrowed and picked up speed. The wheel sat still. Joseph only ran at mornings now. He was rationing what a cracked spoke would still give him. In the low afternoon light, the building had the look of something dropped in a hurry and never quite finished settling into the ground. He opened the door and stood back to let her in ahead of him. Inside it smelled of flour dust and wet stone, and that particular cold that comes off river water even through a wall. She walked the floor slowly, and what struck him was that she didn't look at the machinery first. She looked at the walls, the ceiling joists. The way daylight leaked in through the gaps in the siding. Her hand trailed along the stone as she moved, not testing it exactly. Reading it, the way you read a page you're not sure yet whether to trust. He stood just inside the door and said nothing. He didn't name the parts or explain the trouble. Either she'd see it herself or she wouldn't, and both answers would tell him something worth knowing. She spent nearly 20 minutes in that mill. She crouched to sight the angle on the lower axle bracket. She ran one finger across the furrow pattern of the millstone without touching the dressed face. She looked a long time at the main ceiling beam. Then she walked past him, out the door, and didn't say a word about any of it, not yet. That evening at the kitchen table in his house, which she'd also inspected with the same measuring attention, and said nothing about, she opened the satchel. A ledger came out first. Beneath it, wrapped in a leather sleeve, a small brass-fitted instrument. A spirit level, maybe 6 inches long, a glass vial along its center holding a bubble of trapped air. The whole thing worn smooth at the edges from years of somebody's hands. She went back to the mill without asking permission. He followed without quite deciding to. She set the level against the main beam, one hand steadying it, and watched the bubble settle. It drifted off-center by a hair over 4 degrees. She opened the ledger, wrote the number on the first blank page, and beneath it, in the same careful hand, the date. He watched from the doorway and said nothing at all. Outside, the river kept moving in the dark, the way it always had, the way it would whether either of them said a word about it or not. Here's the thing about Ilse Renner that Cedar Fork didn't know yet, and wouldn't for a while. She'd grown up on the floor of her father's mill outside Bergen. Apprenticing in everything but name, because there was no name in that country for what a girl who could read a stress fracture in oak better than most men could read a newspaper. She'd crossed an ocean and half a continent for reasons that were her own business. What Joseph Marsh had gotten, without knowing it when he mailed that advertisement, was not simply a wife. He'd gotten a millwright who happened to also be willing to marry him. Whether that was luck or something closer to fate, neither of them could have said yet, and honestly. It would take the better part of 2 years before either one worked up the nerve to call it either. The county clerk in Cedar Fork was a narrow, buttoned-up man who'd married off 11 couples before Joseph and Ilse, and he read every ceremony the same flat way. Like he was stamping a form rather than performing a rite. Ruth Danvers, whose husband ran cattle east of town, stood off to one side in her kitchen apron, flour still along the hem. A grease stain darker near the pocket. She'd come straight from her stove and hadn't thought to change, and she stood with her hands folded like a mourner unsure of the etiquette. Outside, somebody was unloading a wagon, and the drop-hand scrape of crates on the plank walk drifted through the window in a steady rhythm under the clerk's voice. Joseph stood with his hat in both hands, working the brim once, then holding it still. When the clerk finally looked up and asked, Ilse said, "Yes." Joseph said, "I do." The clerk made his mark in the register, and that was that, the 9th of October, 1881. At the door, Ruth Danvers took Ilse's hand for a moment, squeezed it, let go. "Welcome to Cedar Fork," she said, and there was something careful folded into it, not unkind. Just careful, the way you'd be careful handing somebody a cup you weren't sure they knew was hot. They walked back to the mill house as the light went amber over the river. That night, Joseph moved his things down the hall to the smaller room, without announcement, without a word about it. She heard the one trip down the hallway, the quiet click of a door. She stood at the window of the main room a while. Then she took the spirit level from the satchel and set it on the sill, brass catching the last of the light. From the mill floor, if you looked up toward the house, you'd see it there, a thin, bright line against the glass. She wasn't placing it for him to notice. She was placing it so she could see it herself from the mill door each morning, a fixed point. The way a millwright always sets one before starting real work. She made tea she didn't drink. She read the grain cooperative's contract, kept in the desk's top drawer, and matched its price per bushel against a figure already written in her ledger with a small mark beside it. The mark meant asterisk revisit. Outside, the river ran on in the dark, same as the night before, same as it would tomorrow. She closed the drawer and went to bed. The level stayed in the window. The mill stood dark below it, waiting on a fix nobody in Cedar Fork had thought to ask for yet. The cold arrived the first week of November like a door somebody forgot to shut, not sudden, just final. The river dropped a few inches and went quiet under it. The wheel turned sluggish in the mornings before it worked itself loose, and Ilse started coming down earlier to watch the output, ledger open. A pencil sharpened every day to the exact same length. Like even that was a measurement worth keeping consistent. She'd been in Cedar Fork 3 weeks when Joseph noticed the tally she'd started keeping without being asked. A mark for every finished grind cycle. A note whenever the output ran short of what the wheel should have given back. A whole column he hadn't asked for and didn't understand yet. He watched from the corner of his own work and kept his questions to himself. The audit, though neither of them called it that, took her 11 evenings at the kitchen table. Working through his ledger against the cooperative contract and the pages she'd filled herself since arriving. She found what she'd expected to find, and then she found something she hadn't expected, and she sat with that one a full minute before she wrote it down. The contract was the first trouble. Joseph had signed it 2 springs back, at a per-bushel rate that made sense for a dry year, when farmers were desperate to move grain fast and cheap. But the rate was locked for 3 seasons, and the 2 seasons since had both been good harvests. The cooperative had been buying low from Joseph and selling high everywhere else, and the gap across those 2 seasons came to more than Joseph had made in either of them combined. She wrote the figure down and drew a hard line under it. The wheel was the second trouble, and she'd half suspected it since her 3rd day, watching the output drop every afternoon without any matching drop in grain volume or river level. She'd taken the level to the wheel housing twice already, and found nothing wrong with the housing itself. It was one of the hired hands, a rangy 14-year-old named Eli Tanner, who showed her without meaning to, pointing at something else entirely, and letting her eye catch the crack low on the 3rd spoke, running with the grain of the wood. In cold weather, the wood flexed along that line. In cold weather, Joseph's mill was losing close to 1/3 of everything it should have produced. She wrote that down too. On a clean page in her own precise hand, she laid out both findings, the contract figure, the wheel figure. A conservative estimate of what fixing each one would recover, and set the page on the counter between the ledger and the coffee tin. Then she went back to the mill floor and kept working like she hadn't just handed a man the worst and best morning he'd had in 2 years. He came in at midday and stopped in the doorway. She could see the edge of the counter from where she stood, not him, but she heard him go still. He read the page once, set it down, read it again. The wheel kept turning outside, missing its fraction, steady in its loss the way it had been steady in it for who knew how long. He was still standing there when she came in for water. He didn't look up right away. When he did, he asked flat, "The wheel first?" She nodded once. "The contract after," he said. "I'll ride to Larkspur before the ground freezes solid. The cooperative sets new terms in January," she said. "You have 6 weeks." He looked back down at the page, folded it once, not sharp, not angry, just folded, and slid it under the ledger's cover. She understood from that small gesture that he meant to keep it. Eli Tanner started on the wheel the 2nd week of January. The temperature dropped the night before he began, and didn't recover for 19 days straight. The Cedar Fork ran dark and slow, not frozen, but close enough that Eli tied a rope to the dock post each morning and went in at first light with his jaw set against the cold. Ilsa watched the first morning from the mill door. He worked without a word of complaint, which she'd expected from him already. What she hadn't expected was how long the fix would take. She brought coffee at 9 and again at 2. No announcement, just set the cup on the dock post and went back inside. He drank it standing, facing the water, steam rising off the cup and off the river, both like they were arguing the same point. By the 4th day, he'd started watching for her before she came out, though he never said so. The damaged spoke came free on the 12th day. Through the small window above the wheel housing, she watched Joseph and Eli lift the broken section clear together. The wood inside was gray straight through. The crack had been there far longer than she'd guessed. Maybe since before Joseph's first wife had died, 3 years back. Maybe longer than that. The new spoke went in on the 16th day. It took 3 more before the housing seat satisfied Eli's exacting eye. He turned out to have an eye for exactness that matched Ilsa's own, though nobody had taught him that on purpose. On the morning of the 19th day, just before noon, he opened the sluice gate. Ilsa was inside at the counter. She heard the wheel change, not in speed, the speed held steady, but in sound. A roughness she'd learned to hear as background, something she'd stopped consciously counting as wrong, went quiet in its absence and became, by that very silence, impossible to miss. The wheel turned clean. No catch, no gap in its rhythm. It turned the way somebody had built it to turn decades ago before anybody alive had let it slip. She picked up the spirit level and walked out. Eli stood at the wheel, housing with river water still dark on his arms to the elbow, and when he saw her coming, his face wasn't quite pride. It was the look of somebody who has fixed a thing that actually mattered and knows it and doesn't need to say so out loud. She set the level on the housing lip. The bubble sat dead center. She lifted it without a word and went back inside. And if you'd asked her right then whether that was the proudest moment of her life so far, she might have surprised you and said yes. You'd think that was the end of the hard part. It wasn't even the middle. The wheel held clean through February. Ilsa watched the output numbers 6 full weeks before she let herself trust them. Eli kept his own tally on a board near the millstone, bushels a day, chalked up plain, and she copied the figures into the ledger each evening without telling him she was doing it. By month's end, the average had climbed. Not dramatically. Steadily, the way a healthy thing grows when nobody's rushing it. In March, she turned her attention to the flour itself. The trouble wasn't the milling. It was that everything coming out of the hopper went into the same sack at the same price. Fine flour, coarse flour, middling still threaded through with bran, all of it sold as though it were one product. Because that was how it had always been done. Because that was how the big combine mill up in Larkspur did it. Because nobody in Cedar Fork had ever once stopped to ask whether it needed to stay that way. Ilsa asked. She built a sifting frame herself out of spare lumber and window screen, and showed Eli how to run flour through it in 3 passes. 4 days of testing told her the grades came out consistent enough to sell separately. She packaged the finest in smaller sacks tied at the neck with a strip of blue cotton. The second grade went in standard sacks. The third she priced under whatever the Larkspur combine charged for their single all-purpose blend. Eli watched all of it the way he watched most things she did, quietly, without questions, learning by observation because he'd come to trust that her instincts were usually worth the wait. In April, she laid the new pricing out for Joseph at the counter after supper. He studied the ledger page a long while, then asked one question. Who buys the blue string sack? Bakers, she said. Boarding houses, anybody selling something they want people to believe is worth more. He nodded once and didn't ask anything further. The following week they rode out together, first to Larkspur, 12 miles north, then to a settlement called Cedarville, 7 miles west. She'd written ahead to both, a boarding house proprietor and a baker who supplied 2 general stores. Joseph drove the wagon. Ilsa carried sample sacks of each grade and the pricing sheet she'd worked out over 3 drafts. Both meetings went about how she'd expected they would, which is to say, well. On the ride back from Cedarville, the road ran alongside a dry creek bed for a mile before climbing toward home, the sun low, the grass gone the color of old copper. The wagon didn't hurry. The sales went well, he said. I know, she said. The quiet that followed wasn't the quiet of 2 people with nothing left to say to each other. It was the quiet of 2 people who just said something whole and were both still turning it over. Neither one looked at the other. The horse kept its pace. The light kept fading, the road kept moving under the wheels the same as it always had, and yet something along it had shifted, small and permanent. The way a spoke sits different once it's finally set true. The man from the combine showed up in June, on a slow Tuesday, wearing a good coat despite the heat, a clean satchel, boots that had never seen a mill floor. He had the look of somebody who traveled between towns for a living and had learned to seem like he'd just come from somewhere grander than wherever he currently stood. He introduced himself as a representative of the Prairie Grain Combine and asked if the owner had a few minutes to talk business. Ilsa was at the table when he came in, the ledger open, tallying spring accounts. She didn't close it, she didn't stand. He sat across from Joseph and laid out his proposition with the easy rhythm of a man who delivered it plenty of times before. The combine was expanding its territory. They preferred buying working mills outright over building new ones from scratch. The number he named would clear every debt Joseph carried and leave something over besides. He said the figure plainly, like it was just a number, which it was, and also very much wasn't. Joseph listened, hands flat on his knees, face giving away nothing. Ilsa kept her eyes on the ledger. Her pen didn't move, but she didn't close the book either. The man glanced her way once, briefly, the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you were still deciding whether to include in a sale. She turned a page. Joseph said he'd need time to think it over. The man said of course, left a card on the table, and rode off into the June heat, unhurried, confident, sure of his own math. Eli appeared in the doorway a moment later, looked at the two of them, and disappeared again without a word. They finished the day's work without discussing any of it. Ilsa closed out the ledger column. Joseph replaced a worn belt on the stone housing. The river ran on, indifferent to offers. That evening, putting away sample sacks, she heard him stop near the doorway, not all the way in, just at the edge of the lamplight. He looked at the floor a moment, then at her. "What do you think?" he said. Not asterisk, "What do you think about the offer?" Not "What do you think we should do?" Just the four plain words. Set down like something he'd been carrying a good distance, and had finally decided to put down where she could see it. "Sit," she said. He sat across from her, the lamp low and steady between them, the ledger open at the current year's column. Beneath the figures she'd already written, a second column in a smaller, more careful hand, her projections. He waited. She set her palm flat on the page, not on the numbers, on the white space beside them. "We don't sell," she said. Not "I think we shouldn't," not "it might be wiser if," just the four words and the stillness that followed them. She walked him through it without being asked. The wheel repair, finished before the ground froze. The sifting frame, running full by February if the lumber came in on schedule. The spring contracts, the ones she'd been quietly renegotiating with the cooperative, pushing for delivery terms the old agreement had never included, those would hold, she was certain of it. She'd run the numbers 3 times, a fourth just to be sure he didn't interrupt. When she finished, she folded her hands in her lap. He studied the columns, studied the projections, studied the dark window that showed nothing now but the sound of the river underneath it. "The combine will come back," he said. "Yes," she said. "And we tell them the same thing." Not a question. He said it the way he said most things, flat, unadorned, like he was confirming a measurement rather than making a decision. But it was a decision, and she heard the full weight land inside it. "Yes," she said again. The lamp guttered once in some draft under the door, then steadied. Neither of them moved to fix it. Whatever passed between them in that room didn't have a name yet, and it wouldn't get one for a while longer. But after that evening, the mill wasn't the thing Joseph had built back in 1876, and it wasn't the thing Ilsa had come out from St. Louis to correct, either. It was something with both their hands on it now. That was the real difference. Nobody declared it, nobody negotiated it. It was simply true the way the river was true, the way the level in her satchel found true, not because anybody announced it, but because the thing itself had finally settled into place. Eli saw it first, the way he always saw things first. The next morning he came in and went straight to work without waiting to be told what needed doing. That was the only sign anybody needed. Now here's where the story could have ended, and honestly, most stories like it do. But Cedar Fork wasn't finished with them yet, and neither was the county fair. The exposition ran the first week of September, 20 miles south along the river road. In a town big enough to have a proper exhibition hall, with whitewashed walls and bunting, strung from the rafters in territorial colors. Ilsa didn't go. There was grain coming in from 3 farms that couldn't wait on a fair, and she said as much when the question came up, and that was the end of the discussion. Joseph went, and Eli went with him to manage the wagon, and Ilsa stayed behind and worked through the Saturday the ordinary way. She'd packed the flour herself, 20-pound bags of the premium grade, triple-sifted winter wheat run through the bolting cloth she'd specified, and Eli had installed that spring. Each bag tied with plain cord, no flourish. She'd said it herself quietly when Joseph asked whether she wanted the bags marked any fancier than the common grade. The flour ought to speak for itself in the grind, not in the wrapping. She didn't ask how the fair went when they got back Sunday evening. She was at the ledger when they came through the door, just past 7, and she noted the time and looked up once and went back to her columns. Joseph hung his hat on the hook and washed at the basin and said nothing. Eli lingered in the doorway a beat longer than usual. She turned a page. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the Territorial Grange, folded around a printed certificate on heavy cream stock. Eli carried it in from the post himself and stood holding it a moment longer than strictly necessary, turning it toward the east window's light, not reading it, just weighing the paper in his hands. The pressed seal at the corner. Then he held it out to her. She read it once, set it on the counter, read it again. First premium, wheat flour, fine grade, Marsh milling, cedar fork. She built the frame herself from a strip of pine Eli cut to her measurement, 4 small brads set with the flat of a chisel, and hung it beside the mill door on a single nail she drove in herself. Then she stepped back, reached into the satchel, and drew out the spirit level, cool in her hand the way it always was no matter the season. She hadn't taken it out in months. She set it against the frame's top edge and read the bubble, dead center. She lowered the level without a word and put it back in the satchel. Eli watched from the doorway and didn't say anything either. He went back to work. The certificate stayed there beside the door through every kind of weather that came after. The last day of December came in gray, the sky low and ash-colored over the cedar fork. The river hadn't frozen, but it ran slow, dark between its banks, a thin skim of ice forming and breaking apart at the edges without ever quite settling. Ilsa sat at the mill office desk most of that afternoon, the ledger open in front of her. She'd already been through the columns twice, and she went through them a third time, not because she doubted the figures, but because she wanted to be certain of them before she wrote the last entry of the year. When she was certain, she wrote it. Net gain, $1,140 over the year prior. The ink dried slow in the cold room. She set the pen down, closed the ledger, left it on the counter where it would catch the light come morning. Then she stood, lifted her coat off the hook, and started to put it on. Joseph was across the room. She hadn't heard him move. He never announced himself, never had, not once in over 2 years. But his hands were there before the coat settled on her shoulders. He took it from her, not roughly, not with any force behind it at all. Just took it, slipped it back off her arms, turned and hung it on the peg. Even the wood took it without a sound. She stood still. He went to the stove. 2 tin cups waited on the shelf above it, same as always. He filled both, set one near the ledger, kept the other for himself. The wheel turned outside, audible through the wall, the low, patient rhythm she'd listened to for 2 years and 3 months now. Through the dry heat of harvest and the first frosts, and every ordinary evening in between. And now this one. The river moved under it the way it always had, the way it would keep moving long after neither of them was left to listen to it. She looked at the cup waiting near her ledger. Then she looked at him. He was looking at the counter, not at her, one hand resting flat beside his own cup, the way it sometimes rested in the evenings when something had finally come to rest inside him too. She sat back down, the coat stayed on the hook, the ledger stayed closed, its last entry written and done. Outside the mill door, past the certificate in its pine frame, the cedar fork ran dark and cold through the last hour of the year, carrying whatever a river carries, ice, silt. The long quiet of every year it never bothers to name. The wheel kept turning. Inside, 2 cups steamed on the counter between them. Neither one of them said a word, neither one of them needed to. So what would you have done, standing on that platform, marrying a stranger sight unseen? Would you have looked at the river first, too? I think about Ilsa Renner a lot, honestly. A woman who crossed an ocean with nothing but a trunk and a spirit level, and ended up fixing a lot more than a broken mill wheel. Tell me where you're watching this from tonight. And if this one got you even a little, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment. I read every one of them, and I've got more stories like this one coming.